Hello world. I wanted to make a video. I think that there are some complicated questions and some interesting things going on around, especially the treatment of Hillary Clinton and by the media and by just people in general. So I made a document. I'm mostly just going to read off of it, but I think this is really important, and there's a lot of sources of confusion. There are a lot of this stuff's important to a lot of people, so I think that their emotions can run high, and there are differences between people's understandings of different issues and people's knowledge bases. Um, and just certainly our personal feelings on some of these things. So I think everybody has some valuable perspective. I think that we all have things to learn from one another, and it's important that we be open-minded and not be too quick to kind of like oversimplify things and discount what what people are saying simply because they seem to fit into certain patterns. Um, because I think that when we do those sorts of things, we run the risk of missing out on some information and of not being able to kind of understand where people are coming from and make ourselves understood. I think that ultimately what everyone has to say comes from some real place, even if we might disagree with the conclusion. I think that like if people can do a good enough job of listening, then we can at least understand each other, um, and make sure that we're doing our part to earnestly and intentionally and thoughtfully contribute to the discourse. So I'm just going to go ahead and start reading off some of these bullet points. So I'm a feminist, but I don't support Hillary Clinton. I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter, and I'm a 34-year-old white man. So I think it's easy to be skeptical of me saying that, and certainly fit into a pattern. And I won't say that I'm not influenced by the patriarchy or by some sorts of biases, because I don't think that there's any way for any of us to really make those kinds of absolute statements. So even though I try to be really careful about those sorts of things, um, who knows? But I want to start by saying that I believe that modern conceptions of femininity um, are more reflective of the traits that I think are best for society, um, than those traits that are associated with modern conceptions of masculinity. When I think of traits that we might describe as feminine, I think of things like caring, thoughtfulness, patience, nurturing, passion, tolerance, sensitivity, and other aspects of humanity that I find to have a lot of value um, in our society. There's a lot of wisdom in a lot of those things, etc. When I think of what we might describe as masculine traits, I often think of things like shallowness, impatience, anger, violence, dominance, apathy, bigotry, insensitivity, short-sightedness, and other human traits that I tend to find challenging and otherwise unfortunate. Um, in general, I'm being very general, of course, but I probably admire more women and to a greater degree than I do men, and I try to model more of those feminine characteristics than I do masculine ones, even if I often fail at that. Thanks, patriarchy. But I tend to think that men can be pretty argumentative, and here I am. So that's fair, right? I also think that women often have more challenges and more challenging challenges in society than men do. So I try to be conscious of that in my thoughts, words, and actions. Again, I'm probably not always as thoughtful as I could be, and maybe that's partly to blame on the social conditioning that's informed my attitudes and behaviors. So maybe this is all bullshit and you can just skip this video. But I think that there are some things that are important for me to say, because I just feel like there's some disconnect between some people who I know to be really thoughtful feminists, who are very critical of Hillary Clinton, and other people I know who are also very thoughtful feminists who are critical of the people who are critical of Hillary. Um, and I think that I understand a lot of where that comes from, and I just feel like there's a disconnect, and I want to address that. Maybe there are things that I'm missing. I'm sure. I mean, I can't understand every perspective perfectly all at the same time. So it's very likely that there are things that I'm missing out on. But I feel like there's been something missing in the discussion that I see being had. And so I just want to contribute to that, what I think is maybe lacking. So Clinton gets a lot of unfair criticism of certain sorts. People criticize things like her voice, like her what she wears. Certain aspects of her personality are kind of simplified and made to fit into certain patterns, that I would say are really unhealthy. Ideas about femininity in society in general. But she also gets a lot of criticism that I think is completely fair insofar as she's a politician, and I think that we should be critical of politicians. We should be critical of the people who are making decisions for us, the ways that they're making those decisions, what their kind of historical record shows, and some of that can be informed by certain aspects of character. So that gets really murky. Attacks on Clinton's character are really complicated. Some attacks on her honesty, integrity, decisiveness, and corruptibility are almost definitely rooted in hidden misogyny, because there's a line of thought that says that women embody some of these negative characteristics. I think that there are people who really feel like women particularly tend to adopt some of these traits that we would mostly say aren't good traits in humans. And I think that's really unfair, and it comes from, really kind of messed up places. And those ideas I think are worth thinking about and criticizing. But I think it's important that we critically inspect these arguments and from where they come. Also, we might say that some of these features are common in politicians, but I don't think that makes it wrong for someone to be critical of these features in any politician, regardless of gender. So, I think that's something that's interesting that's happening with Clinton, is people are saying, oh, well, if you say that she's not trustworthy, you're contributing to a narrative about women. After all, what we know is that politicians are generally viewed as not being trustworthy. But the thing is that when we criticize politicians, sometimes we criticize them for not being trustworthy. So it may be that there's this general perception that politicians aren't trustworthy, and that Clinton gets unfairly judged just by virtue of the fact that she's kind of lumped in that way. But I think the argument I'm going to make is that, as unfortunate as it is to say this, and I don't want to be in a position where I'm risking contributing to this negative narrative, this misogynistic narrative. I think it's also true, and it's very unfortunately true, that Hillary Clinton's behaviors are reflective of some very negative traits in terms of what you would want out of a politician. So this happens to coincide, and that really makes things awkward, and it makes it challenging. It creates some tensions and some confusion, I think. So I'm going to go into some of that. I'd certainly love if we were aware of these issues, though, and tried to reflect this awareness in how we treat these questions. A female president would certainly be a big symbolic victory, but Clinton seems to be like I said, a particularly unfortunate candidate as the first possible female president. If it were Elizabeth Warren running for president, I'd still be as in love with Bernie Sanders as I have been for the past decade or so. I've known about Bernie Sanders for a long time and been a huge fan for a long time. But I've had, similarly amorous feelings for Senator Warren as well. When it comes down to it, I think that Warren's actually generally, well, that she was more popular leading into this election cycle, and that she's not dissimilar to Bernie Sanders. I certainly wouldn't be very critical of Warren in most ways. I think she'd be an amazing candidate, and it would have been really cool to see her run against Bernie Sanders. And maybe in the end, what I would have decided is that, I mean, this is just kind of me personally, but maybe the fact that she's not that different from Sanders and the fact that she's a woman will kind of be like getting to have my cake and eat it too in certain ways. But there are lots of problems that I have with Hillary Clinton as a political candidate, so I'm just going to go ahead and outline some of those. I think that she's a particularly problematic candidate. So there have been multiple reports throughout, since the 90s to indicate that Hillary Clinton sought out Bill Clinton's mistresses at different times, just in order to quiet them and keep them from harming Bill's political career. So I think that's pretty problematic for several different reasons. I'm sure that a lot of people can kind of come to their own opinions on that. But Hillary Clinton back in the 90s fought briefly for universal health care while Bill was president. And then basically she was bought by the insurance companies. So she, the other night in the debate, asked when's the time. So that's one time when she was influenced by political money. And another time is Elizabeth Warren tells a story about how the pharmaceutical industry... I'm sorry, Wall Street. So the pharmaceutical industry, also played a role back in the 90s with the universal healthcare thing. But Wall Street, there was this bill that had to do with bankruptcy and how it would affect women especially. Warren kind of convinced Clinton to oppose the bill when Bill Clinton was president. But then when Hillary became senator, the effect of Wall Street and Wall Street's money became too strong, and she ended up voting for this bill that would be especially harmful to women. There were other problems with the bill, but this is another time when we can say that she was directly influenced by the money. It'd be really hard to see it another way. Of course, there's always some room for doubt, but I think that we can say with some confidence that was the case there. Now, another issue that's really big with Hillary Clinton is flip-flopping. She has a propensity to flip-flop in a way that's just historic, I would say. I mean, I don't know of another political candidate, in the last several decades who's flip-flopped nearly as much as she has. But this is tricky for a few reasons. First, I'm going to acknowledge that politicians should be able to change their minds, and they often do. And I think it's important that we give them some leeway to do that. But we do criticize politicians, regardless of gender, for flip-flopping. And sometimes that's unfair. Sometimes, though, the flip-flopping, I don't know why I can't say that. Sorry. But the flip-flopping is so frequent and so consistent with certain political realities that the person faces that it makes them seem ingenuine. And it hurts their trustworthiness, I would say. So this is further complicated in the case of Hillary Clinton because I think that there are some people who seem to think that women aren't trustworthy and that they're indecisive. So this is a narrative that we don't necessarily want to contribute to, right? I certainly don't. So in that sense, this is, I would say, unfair toward women in general, and often toward Hillary in particular. I think she's attacked unfairly in this way, often by a lot of people. But some of this criticism is totally justified. A lot of it is rooted in just the empirical reality in terms of like how often she flip-flops and the context in which she flip-flops. I think it's very different when someone's kind of grappling over an issue for a long time and you know, that maybe, and that it'd be one thing if it weren't so consistently politically advantageous, um, and if she didn't flip flop back and forth in some cases. But yeah, Hillary's flip flops are especially troublesome for their frequency, and like many of her objectionable behaviors, for their coincidence with certain political opportunities. As an example, Clinton flipped from being pro-gun control, pretty staunchly pro-gun control, I would say, through the 90s and the early 2000s, um, to being permissive of gun ownership to such a degree that Obama jokingly called her Annie Oakley in 2008. And now she's pro-gun control again. So while this flipping back and forth might seem problematic enough on its own, it's it's especially interesting because she's kind of raking Bernie over the coals for his position on guns, a position that earns him a D- rating from the NRA. I don't like his gun position that well, but it's not as though he's not Annie Oakley. I mean, she wasn't either. I mean, like, maybe that was even unfair of Obama. But the point is that, like, she's taken, positions that were soft on guns, and now she's criticizing Bernie for being soft on guns. And he's from Vermont, a state that's very pro-guns. And, in fact, he's lost elections because he was for gun control. So he's taken these political risks. Whereas Clinton, each flip on this issue, and, like all of her flips, I would say, is perfectly and simply explained by the politics that she was facing at that time. Depending on what position she was going for, and what the atmosphere was at the time. I'm sorry, I lost my place. I need some like background music to fill in the space. I'm so sorry. But so she very rarely takes a position that isn't consistent with a pretty easily identifiable political strategy, and rarely does she take a position that will cost her more votes than it'll gain her. In fact, I'm saying rarely. I can't think of a time where she kind of took a risk like that. Like, there are times where you could say, well, I don't know. We don't need to get into deep like political analysis, but Clinton's history of racism is pretty consistent too. From her super predator statement to the 3 a.m. phone call ad, to her campaign's leak of Obama's relationship with Reverend Wright, and their initiation of birtherism. Through the suggestion that Obama might not have been born in the U.S. Now she claims to be for criminal justice reform, which runs contrary to Bill Clinton's some legislation in the 90s on criminal justice. Like, there's a 3 strikes law on their relationship with private prisons and different things. But so she's supposed to be for criminal justice reform, but she also used the racist phrase "all lives matter" in response to Black Lives Matter protesters earlier in this campaign. We could go into why all lives matter is like a racist thing to say, but that's a whole other thing, and I'm just going to assume that you guys can either know what I mean when I'm talking about that, or that you have good Google skills. There are a few lies that Clinton says in just about every debate. And, probably like in her stump speeches and stuff like that. I don't watch a lot of her speeches, so I can't really say with any certainty that that's the case. But just as an example, one that Clinton says is that, and she continually says it, she's been called out on it several times by now, by Sanders and by others, but she says that Sanders means to start over with universal health care, which is a lie. There's no justification for saying this. But her saying that is likely to scare a lot of people and give people a negative perception of Bernie Sanders' plans in regard to health care. In fact, Sanders' plan would only add to the accomplishments of Obamacare. There's no way to think of Sanders' plans as like starting anything over. There's nothing that's ending and starting again. It doesn't. It's misleading. I think it's pretty obviously intentionally misleading, but she continues to say it just to trick people into voting for her in some sense. But if you, I mean, so on that note, if you consider the difference in health outcomes for women, that would coincide with the policies of each candidate. And Hillary seems like a lot of issues, she's kind of like bending toward Bernie's position. But obviously, if we got universal health care, then health outcomes for women improve. So if you're a feminist, then maybe that's something to consider. Clinton, to go in a different direction, Clinton's gotten huge donations from Wall Street, the fossil fuel industry, big pharma, private prisons, insurance companies, Walmart. She says that Obama did the same thing, but Obama, when he was running in 2008, interestingly, and the main reason I would say that I voted for him, along with Guantanamo Bay. So these are two things. Well, there are a few issues. Some of the most important issues to me were things that never ended up happening, thanks to primarily to this obstructionist Congress. But he ran on campaign finance reform. That was like a big thing that he kept talking about. But regardless of the fact that this has kind of been the status quo, the fact is that most Americans don't want it, and most Americans can agree why it's problematic, our campaign finance system. But Hillary actually spoke in front of NASDAQ leading up to the housing bust, or right around the time of the housing bust, partially blaming home buyers for the housing bust. She gave this long speech, and she talked about all of the things that kind of led to the housing bust, including some of the actions by the banks and by the insurance companies. By this point, there was no political, she didn't run any political risk by saying these things. And she was pretty soft on the banks. In fact, there's been a lot made of Hillary's speeches, and particularly her speech to Goldman Sachs. And it's actually been described by several Goldman Sachs employees as very complimentary of Goldman Sachs. I haven't read anything that suggests that anyone would describe it in any different way. But when Clinton says that she went to Wall Street and told them to cut it out, like these are her words exactly, cut it out, there's no evidence that she said that. In fact, like all the evidence that we have suggests that it's untrue, that she's lying when she says it. In fact, she's long been a big proponent of the big banks, and she's been forgiving of them, which makes sense considering that she gets lots of money from them. So her finger wagging isn't on public record, so far as I'm aware, and she refuses to show the transcripts, which all accounts say were really complimentary of the big banks, really forgiving of them. So it doesn't match with, kind of the image that she's attempting to portray. According to every account of the speeches she's given, they were basically the opposite of what she describes. Instead, Clinton goes out of her way to blame lots of people for the recession, including homebuyers themselves, who were preyed upon by lenders, while she praises the big banks and takes their money. If corruption in politics is something that you see as commonplace, and let's agree, I mean, like, it is in some sense. We have a legalized system of corruption is what we have. And if that's a-okay with you, if you're okay with the status quo, then maybe Clinton's the candidate for you. But I think that there's an argument to be made that if disrupting the status quo and if disrupting current power dynamics is attractive to you, then maybe Bernie Sanders is a more attractive candidate in a lot of ways. I think I'm making kind of a shallow argument. I'm making a very simple argument right now. So you can certainly poke some holes in that, I think, if you try hard enough. But I think that maybe it makes sense to say that, if you want things to be different, then maybe going with a candidate who's very explicitly, trying to change things in a wholesale way makes a lot more sense than someone who's just kind of middle of the road in a lot of ways. Anyway, so I'm laying out a lot of criticisms against Hillary Clinton, but I also think it's important to note that that there are other sides to this argument. It's likely that it would have been more difficult for Clinton to have achieved what she has without having, kind of played the game. I'm going to quit with air quotes. I think they're silly. But she's kind of played the game in certain ways, right? Women shouldn't have to deal with extra challenges that men don't have to. And I'd love to see, continued work in correcting a lot of these unfairnesses. Certainly I want to contribute to correcting that where I can, and I love to see, people doing what they can to change things in that way. But basically, I think that Clinton's worthy of a lot of criticism, just as all politicians are, regardless of gender or race or any other consideration. She gets a lot of unfair criticism. Some criticisms of Clinton are fairer when some people say them than they are when other people say them, because they come from different places in terms of biases. And so this is really tricky, right? So I think it's important for us to recognize that it's impossible for people to know where we're coming from if we don't say where we're coming from. And even in those cases, there's a lot of deserved skepticism, and I think that's appropriate in a lot of ways. I think that we can take responsibility, or that I'm sorry, I don't know what I wrote here. I feel there's some appropriate responsibility on the parts of those who are offering criticisms to be clear in recognizing that the criticisms can appear to be unfair, and that there's the possibility that these criticisms can be partly informed by unfair biases. So it's true that maybe that can always be said, right? Well, it's difficult to know, how, kind of impartial we're being. We're never being impartial, right? So there's always some bias that's informing what we say, and trying to make sense of that is difficult, and trying to convey that understanding and be conscious of it is challenging, I think. But I think it's important to try to do that. We should try to do our best. I don't think any particular individual needs to be held to necessarily a super high standard, but it'd be nice if we each tried to be aware of these issues when engaging with these sensitive issues. To be conscious of our own biases, and to recognize that everybody's views come from somewhere, and it comes from their reality that's unique to them, and there's some validity in their reality. So it's hard to keep all these conflicting issues simultaneously in mind and make sense of them. Maybe that's even impossible. But I want to be conscious of these tensions and attentive to the narratives that are out there. I don't want to contribute to any narrative that contributes to systemic problems. That was an awkward sentence. I wish I had written that a little bit differently. But yeah, I don't want to make things worse than they are in some of these ways, contribute to these injustices. It's impossible, though, I think, to ignore those things about Hillary Clinton's record that make her an unfortunate candidate, and kind of just be honest with ourselves. I think it's good to be thoughtful in how we criticize her and recognize the ways in which what we might say might have some unintended negative consequences. I don't know why I'm writing this way. I think that it's important that we be thoughtful and make sure that we're doing what we can when we think of it to be mindful of the unintended consequences that might result from the things that we say. After all, not everyone's going to know why we're saying what we're saying and the degree to which we've considered possible problems. And after all that, anyone could simply turn out to be wrong at any time, including ourselves, right? So choosing our world leaders is important, and I think it's good to be critical in how we do that, to not oversimplify things, to not contribute to problems, and to keep open minds as we try to introduce nuance and continually problematize these questions. It's really easy in these situations, I think, especially where emotions can run so high. There's so much sensitivity around the implications of electing a certain candidate and in how we make those how we come to those decisions. In the case of Hillary Clinton, I happen to think, after really thinking about all the problems that can be implied by me saying so, I think that she's really a scary candidate in a lot of ways and emblematic of a lot of problems with politics in general. But I understand that some of that can look like I'm just kind of falling in line with these negative attitudes toward women, and I think that really sucks. It's not anyone's fault, really. I mean, I don't know. I try to not blame anyone for anything, so there's that. But I don't have any expectation of anyone's behavior, and I think that everyone has a valuable perspective. But I think it's also important that we be true to our values, while also respecting one another and one another's opinions. So that's basically it. I think that it's consistent to be a feminist and to be critical of Hillary Clinton. And I totally understand why that's complicated, or some of the reasons why that can be complicated. I'm sure I don't necessarily understand every reason why it could be complicated, but I love you.